Okay, welcome to Unit 10, and we're going to start Unit 10 by talking, kind of continuing the story of modernism. And I have a little bit of a confession to make here. You guys probably should have watched all of Unit 9 and now have started Unit 10, but I actually recorded these two art historical videos back to back so that it helped me kind of keep a coherent sense of the story of modernism from the beginning through the end. And so this part of modernism, which sometimes we refer to as late modernism or the high modernism, and I don't go all the way to the very end of modernism, which we may cover in the next unit. Um, but that would include like abstract expressionists like Pollock and all the way into minimalism. But we go to as I said, this is kind of the high modernism. So in many ways you would see it as the high point. But one of the things that's interesting about the time period that we call high modernism is that unlike many other high periods of an art movement, this is not a period marked by a lot of coherence, a lot of consistency between artists. Instead, it's a period marked by a whole lot of diversity, a whole lot of variety. It seemed like at this period, art was multiplying and remultiplying into breaking off into different movements. And every time you turned, there was a new group of 5 to 10 artists saying, we are an art group and we're going in this direction. And each group would be kind of have some sort of idea of where they were taking art, and certain great artists in that group who were really doing amazing work. So one of the things to get from this story right away is that high modernism is a lot about fracturing and diversity, and just lots of everyone kind of pursuing their own version of individual truth. There are certain things that tie everything together, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some of the big themes, and probably the biggest theme is the theme of formal purity and formal essentialism. If you remember from the previous lecture, I talked about how essentialism and the focus on honesty was a really important part of modernism, and we see that at the beginning of modernism with realism, right, where it was honesty about the way the world really looked, and an honesty about the social situation of the world, the fact that some people are poor and that living a poor life is not a fun and pleasant thing, right? That is realism. And then by the time we get to the Impressionists, it's much more about optical realism. Like, this is the way colors actually work in the real world. This is the way ambient color really works, rather than the kind of the muddy kind of painting with earth tones to begin with kind of approach to color that was kind of a traditional, or was quite popular in the Romantic period, like let's say Jericho, right? The Impressionists were saying, yeah, that's all fine and good, but this is the way we actually see color when we're sitting out there in the field and looking at this landscape. And then also the painting started to become much more honest about painting is just marks on a surface. And that's where formal purity started to become a really important part of modernism, because by the time we get to something like, Mondrian and the works of the distilled movement, we have painters who are making paintings that are trying their best to make paintings that are honest about this is just shapes on a canvas, right? So it's a different type of honesty, but in some ways you could say this is probably, these are these two paintings, this apprentice painting by Malevich and this Mondrian, are probably the two most honest paintings I discuss in this class, if you look at it in that way. So yeah, that's kind of the story we're going to cover. Let's get into it. So to begin with, one of the things I want to say is that one of the themes about modernism is individuality and expression. And this will come back in and out again and again, that many of the artists saw that the whole point of modernism was that they were being freed. Remember kind of what I said about Van Gogh, and how Van Gogh saw Monet as kind of like as freeing for him. That like if Monet could do this, even though what Monet was doing was primarily about seeing and being truthful to how he saw, and about color and being truthful to the way the colors actually worked, for Van Gogh, that was liberating, in that like, well, then my paintings can go in these directions. And I think there's that trend in modernism of individual artists seeing modernism as a means by which the artist can be all about individual expression, right, and personal expression, is definitely a part of modernism. In some ways, you could see this as a continuation of some of the ideals of Romanticism. So here we have Edvard Munch, who is a perfect example of an artist who made art that was very personal and very expressive, and used the freedom that modernism gave him to do just that. He was also a brilliant printmaker. Look at that. And another artist who is similarly was very kind of expressive and allowed and used his part of being part of modernism as a way of just as being as experimental as possible, but also being as personally expressive as possible, would be James Ensor. I don't even have the info on this slide. I do apologize for that. We've seen Christ appearing in Brussels before. That was in our lecture when we talked about art and religion. And so at the same time, we also have another trend where some artists like Bonnard, and we don't have time today to talk about Vuillard and some of the other intimist painters, but we will talk about them a little bit when we get to the art impulse at the end of this unit. But some artists were more interested in not just how expressive they could be, but also about how they could play with color and shape, and the optical effects of color. And I think Bonnard, I love how he does certain things like really narrows the value range in his paintings, so that then the warm and cool interaction between colors becomes very kind of very hot, very active, where he can make very neutral colors feel very very colorful because they're paired with very warm colors and very but colors of similar value. And also this kind of interest in letting shapes of color bleed into others, which I mentioned earlier. I talked about that effect a little bit when we were talking about shape organization, and how in a way this is kind of like a similar version to what like someone like Géricault did with value, where he would he would do kind of like this meta shape organization by grouping all of the darks together and grouping all of the lights together. And here Bonnard's kind of doing that more on a warm and cool kind of organization, where the warms, especially certain values of warms, all start to unite into a group, and then the cools all start to unite into a group. And you may notice from the amount of Bonnard that I'm showing that I really, truly love Bonnard. I think he's one of the greatest painters of the 20th century. And we will look at, I think we'll probably see all of these works over again when we get to the intimist lecture at the end of this unit. And Matisse was also kind of like going in a different direction. And one of the directions that I think that, you know, some of the color ideas at first between Matisse and some of the intimists were similar, and Matisse and some of the other artists who were known as the wild beasts, the fauvists, were similar. Whoop, that's my 1 minute warning. But the main thing I want to say is that Matisse took it into a more kind of design kind of direction, where he started to really become interested in just breaking things down in terms of shape. We'll talk about that some more when we come back to part 2.